So today my topic title is Reflections on the Implementation of the Upgrading of Informal Settlements Program Instrument, and my case study is Slovo Park. So today can you see the next slide? Title is Reflections on the Implementation of the Upgrading of Informal Settlements Program Instrument. So really this and my case presentation is based on the third case study of my PhD, which I registered in 2016. And so the actual topic of my PhD is why do equity, orientation, progressive planning policies fail to address the apartheid city? Presentation is based on an examination of planning instrumentality in South Africa. So really what I'm doing in the PhD is looking at planning instruments. So trying to understand why planning really has such limited effect in transforming the apartheid landscape. An examination of planning instrumentality, fragmentation, and separation. So really what I'm doing, and while I acknowledge that there are many factors involved in that, my PhD is really just focusing on the instruments of planning, what we utilize as planning. And it was really inspired by the literature, while I literature and many on instrumentality, the legales and lescons. So basically see the instruments as being derived from conflicted or negotiated processes, and thereby reflecting the relationship between the governing and the governed. Furthermore, they see instruments as institutions that need to be constructed rather than readily available objects. And as such, they argue that these instruments affect how actors behave and how they create uncertainties from the effects of the balance of power, that they will eventually privilege certain actors and interests and exclude others, and they constrain actors while offering them possibilities, and they drive forward a certain representation of problems. So it's really looking at all aspects, not just the documents themselves and the wording of instruments, but the circumstances by which instruments are formulated and how they implement it, to try and get a better understanding of the lack of implementation processes. So my third case study is looking at informal settlement upgrading in South Africa, and that's been informed by recent literature, my involvement into just over 30 years in informal settlement upgrading in South Africa, and a synthesis of some alternative ideas emerging from current practices in South Africa. The contents of my presentation this afternoon is to give you a background to the housing and informal settlement situation in South Africa, to give you a brief outline of what the South African government's approach to informal settlement upgrading is, and then I'll briefly look at a case study that I've been involved in for a number of years now, to see how that instrument is being applied in that particular area, and then finally I'll reflect on the efficacy of that instrument at the end. So really the problem that we're facing, very briefly, is that the existing instrument to address informal settlement upgrading in South Africa is the Upgrading of Informal Settlements Program, something called the UISP, and it's one of 16 different policy instruments that the state uses to provide housing to very low-income people in South Africa, as a result of the legacy of apartheid. So its aim is to formalize informal settlements using a very linear process of development. And ironically, it's taken the state almost 15 years since they first devised this instrument to actually begin to engage with it. And the irony is that now that we're beginning to engage with it, we're seeing its shortcomings, and that actually it's a very inappropriate instrument. And ironically, so moving on to housing challenge in South Africa, we actually begin to engage with it. So I don't know if you can see my cursor on this map. That red dot is Johannesburg, where I am based. South Africa is made up of 9 provinces. So you have a national government, and then you have provinces, which are like a federal system. They have a certain amount of power, and within each of these provinces are local government municipalities. So South Africa has 3 tiers of government, which is relevant to the application of policy instruments. So we have roughly, since 2002 to 2016, there's been an increase in formal, what we perceive as formal housing. And there's images of it here. Informal housing has basically remained the same, 13.2%, now 13.9%. So there's been a very slight increase. There's been an increase in then there's traditional structures in mainly rural areas, and there has been a decrease in those. And that's really been taken up by the formal housing delivery by the state for low-cost households. So what you're seeing here is quite a variety of housing forms. On the top right here is Johannesburg and the northern suburbs, where majority of still white population live, and the elite. And you see it's a nice leafy suburbs. So what you see not far from there is already some informal settlements. This is Alexandra with the background of Sandton in the northern suburbs. In the foreground is Alexandra Township, the previous group areas townships in Johannesburg. Here you're seeing the juxtaposition of informal settlements and suburbs, wealthy suburbs. And this graphic here is of the traditional townships that were built for effectively black labor during the apartheid period. This is a picture of Soweto, which is quite a well-known area of Johannesburg. And this picture here is really the new RDP housing that has been rolled out over the last so many years. So this is really the challenge facing South Africa at the moment in terms of housing provision, Soweto, which is quite well known. And that in 1994, at the end of apartheid, this picture here is really the new RDP. There was basically a 1.5 million households backlog of what they classified as adequate shelter for people. And that was really the legacy of apartheid, of discrimination against certain groupings in the country. At the end of apartheid, the new post-apartheid government, the new democratic government, instituted housing policies in 1997, and they rolled out really the legacy housing, redistribution and development program housing, and it was just to focus on top structures. And they rolled out 2.65 million by 2012. Unfortunately, in the same year, they calculated that they still had a growing backlog of 2.3 million. In 2018, they had rolled out 4.77 million of these, what they then called breaking new ground, which they now call breaking new ground housing, which I will briefly explain further along, and 1.14 million serviced sites. But at the same time, in 2018, they still had 2.1 million households needing adequate shelter. So basically, they're not addressing the backlogs, let alone future growth. And these backlogs are determined by waiting lists. People put their names on waiting lists for adequate housing, which in itself can be quite a problematic process. So basically, they're not addressing the backlogs, but we can discuss that. So here's an image of the RDP housing that they've rolled out. This is near Johannesburg, on the edges of Johannesburg. Most of it is on the edges of the city because the land is cheap, and they only allocated a small budget to the cost of land. So what people would get, so everyone earning below basically 17,300 rupees per month, most of it is on the edges of the city because the land is cheap. As a South African citizen, allocated a small budget, not owning any other properties, so there are a range of criteria. They could apply for a subsidized house from the state, and they would get a service plot, which is freehold tenure, and a top structure of started at 15 square meters and is now 45 square meter structure. So what they did is they rolled out these houses in the millions, but they didn't roll roll out integrated settlements. There's very few schools, very few clinics, parks, all of the things that make up decent urban environments were left out because they were just focusing on building the top structure. So again, to put that into graph, the challenge they're facing, very few clinics, is parks, that all of the things that make up in the early days there was a solid increase in production of these houses, and what we've seen since the economic meltdown of 2008, global meltdown, there's been a consistent decline in delivery of these structures, and now especially in the last 2 to 3 years there's been a significant decline because of the COVID. But even prior to that, there were budget constraints, and there's been a real decline in delivery. Consistent decline in delivery. So that takes us now to focusing on especially informal settlements in South Africa. So, what is the scope of the issue? Approximately 1.3 million households, or 8.2% of all households in South Africa, live within informal settlements. Of that, 800,000 of those people are children under the age of 12, which has implications for future generations. Approximately 1.3 million households, and so it approximately makes up 13% of the total population of South Africa in these circumstances. And most of the informal settlement urban form is really corrugated iron. And this comes from a legacy of very poor tenure security. So people are used to being forcibly relocated at short notice, so they haven't invested in their structures at all. And so you see images here, the densities, the nature of these iron structures. So people are used to being, here you see them juxtaposition with formal neighborhoods, middle income neighborhoods at all. Even in this image down at the bottom here is on the Western Cape, in amongst the very fancy winelands of the country. You have these informal settlements, very poor infrastructure, or almost no infrastructure whatsoever. They have a few standpipes, even and the latrines for toilets. So between 1994, post-apartheid, and now post-apartheid, there were 300 of these settlements in the country. There are now over 2,200 of these settlements in South Africa. And now focusing down on Johannesburg as a metropolitan area, 1994, post-apartheid, it's a city of approximately 5.9 million people, a metropolitan area. Half of the households in this metropolitan area earn below 12,000 rupees per month. So there's huge inequality in this city. I think South Africa competes with Brazil as one of the most inequitable countries on earth in terms of GDP and income. So 19%, 1.13 million of these people in Johannesburg live in informal settlements. And to the right here, the map of Johannesburg. There, where my cursor is the CBD, the Central Business District. It is a multi-centered city. So we have Sandton here, which is the economic center, the new economic center, or newish economic center of the city. We have Rosebank here, and all of this area here within the ring road around the city is the wealthy northern suburbs that you saw an image of earlier. And then you see where the apartheid townships were of Soweto, on the edges here. Across from the mining belt, this open area in the middle of the city is the mining belt, the gold reef, which is still largely undevelopable because of the mining, past mining activities and polluted land from the mining. So it's used for industrial purposes and logistic purposes. And so all of these squares you see on this map here are the informal settlements in Johannesburg. And as you see, they're all on the periphery of the city and far away from the polluted land work opportunities. So it's used for industrial purposes and logistical purposes. And just to indicate how out of touch on this map here some of the politicians have been, in 2009, the then mayor, Masondo of Johannesburg, declared that they would upgrade all the 180 settlements in Johannesburg by 2014. Well, now in 2021, we now have 210 informal settlements that have not been upgraded. So they've really made zero progress and have actually gone backwards. Settlements in Johannesburg. So these have been some of the proposals that have been put forward by the state, by private companies, to develop integrated mega projects, basically mini cities on the periphery of Johannesburg. I think 5 were proposed over the last few years. So these have been some of the proposals. These are the kinds of images that they're projecting of these new settlements, where they would accommodate, they maintain a lot of these poor households. Of course, none of these new over the last few developments have actually emerged. What has emerged is some what they call mega projects is simply RDP projects assembled together in one large area, and then they have made greater attempts to put in integrated services, more schools, things like that. They call them mega projects. RDP projects. Another more recent approach is under this breaking new ground, and then they have is something called breaking new ground walk-up. So it's basically taking people from informal settlements and giving them, if they qualify as South African citizens, and earning below that amount provided earlier, below 17,000 rupees, they would be given a unit in a 4-story walk-up. So it's basically taking people from informal settlements. And this is largely being driven by the private sector in partnership with the government. And what they were in such a rush to develop these units to make profits in terms of putting more people per square kilometer into these units, that they failed to examine how you manage the ongoing maintenance of these units. So now in 2021, we're currently doing research into some of these developments. So this was in 2016. Now in 2021, one's already seen how these units are beginning to decline. There's no communal payment system. There's no money for maintenance. So when you have sewage leaks, water leaks, there's no money to maintain it. And the people hold freehold title. So basically they are responsible for their own maintenance of these areas. So what we see in here is a huge problem that's going to be emerging over the coming years. So when you have sewage leaks, water leaks. So coming down to Slovo Park, it's an informal settlement, about 23 kilometers from the CBD of Johannesburg. Here you see the mining belt running through the center. Here's the old township of Soweto. Tembisa, you can see the urban form on the aerial photograph, the very dense horizontal urban form of Alexandra, Tembisa, Soweto. These are the huge, previously exclusively black areas in terms of the group areas under apartheid. So Slovo is in the form. It has currently 3,734 households. Previously, it was set up in 1994 on a vacant piece of land. One of the community members went over the highway to this suburb across the way and measured up the blocks, and they repeated the measurements in this layout and laid out the area. Community members went over the highway to this suburb. So I won't take you through the details of this history, but effectively in 1994 already the city promised to incorporate them into a formal housing development. That never happened. Between 1994 and 2007 there were various feasibility studies undertaken. There was dolomite found on the site, which is a rock under the ground that forms sinkholes if there's a lot of moisture in the ground. So they basically suggested that most of the population should be relocated. In 2007, the community formed a formal organization called the Slovo Park Community Development Forum. 2007, they continued to negotiate with the city. The city varied how many sites they could provide, how many houses they could provide, from 600, 500 to 2,500. They continued to negotiate, but basically they never delivered. And then finally in 2012, the community got together with a legal NGO and they went to the High Court. And in 2016, they got a High Court order granted to them to order the local municipality to adopt the UISP policy, basically their own policy. They ordered them to adapt it, to implement it. And so between 2016 and 2021, very little progress has been made, despite regular meetings with the community. I sit on a technical advisory committee to the community. Very little progress, and in this year, all they've done is manage to get approval for the first phase of funding from the province. I sit on a technical advisory committee. So just to step back to explain that there was a big shift in policy from RDP to something called Breaking New Ground in 2004. And this was really their acknowledgement that they couldn't just roll out individual houses. They had to create more integrated urban environments, linking them into the economy, creating jobs, providing individual houses, ancillary land uses, etc. And so out of that new policy, Breaking New Ground, which came out in 2004, that emerged the Upgrading of Informal Settlements program. And there they acknowledge that they needed a paradigm shift to refocus from the existing policy that was back in 2004 of responses towards informal settlements from one of conflict or neglect to one of integration and cooperation. So certainly the intent was all there. So this policy basically gets the local municipalities to do an assessment and categorization of informal settlements within their municipality. And what they do there is they divide them into 4 categories. 2 categories are full conventional upgrade in situ, where the settlements are. They'll upgrade them in terms of services, tenure, and so forth, where they are standing. B1 is they will eventually upgrade them where they are, but that there are various legal impediments to it. And then there is another 2 categories where they're going to relocate the communities, but after a certain time, which is B2, and they'll provide emergency services in the interim. And then there's a category C, which is immediate relocation because of threat, environmental threat, or any other danger that they may face. Unfortunately, most municipalities in the interim assessed and categorized their settlements as B2, which means eventual relocation. But effectively, there's no land to relocate these settlements to. So, taking that as 4 phases, they now have. So, once they've decided they're going to implement, they then have 4 phases, which is the first feasibility phase. The second one is securing the land, doing socioeconomic profiling of the community, and putting in interim services. Phase 3 is undertaking detailed planning, or what they call township establishment, doing a detailed layout of the area, doing environmental impact assessment, interim services, all of those kinds of things, and putting in social amenities and formalizing tenure. And then phase 4 is where they build top structures for those who qualify, applying using different policy instruments for funding. So really, after 27 years or 20 years of engagement with the city, all they have is phase 1 application funding approved to proceed with the project. So really, in the interim, they have undertaken a social, not in the interim, prior to this happening, there was some initiatives like a socioeconomic survey. Consultants were appointed to do a layout for the area. They have undertaken in 2019, interim electricity was installed into the area. No tenure issues have been even discussed. They produced a layout that was rejected by the community because it basically would have required too many people being forcibly relocated. And so we're still now waiting for a new set of consultants to come into the project. And that's where we are. So they haven't started phase 4 and they've done some aspects of phase 3. And so we're still now waiting for a new set of consultants to come into the project. Now just reflecting, so they haven't started phase 4 and they've done on this application of this instrument in terms of Slovo Park informal settlement. Firstly, very little progress has been made from the time they settled there as a community 27 years ago. They have some basic water connections. They have some very little progress has been made. Chemical toilets, and they have some interim electricity installed, which is causing a lot of problems because it's breaking down frequently and so forth. And that's where we're at the moment. Clearly, they weren't even able to follow the 4 phases because some aspects of phases 1 up to 3 have been implemented in an interim manner. And then looking at what are some of the possible reasons for this lack of progress over this period. One of the major reasons has been historical conflicts between the community and the city officials and politicians over unfulfilled promises and differing approaches. One of the major reasons has been and there were long periods where there was absolutely no contact between the community and the local authorities, especially around when the community took them to the High Court. The city refused to engage with them until the High Court's order came out from the community ordering the city to engage with the community. Developments undertaken by the community, such as at one point with a local university built a small community centre, but that's never been maintained because of lack of funding. The city never took it over to maintain. The city has a huge reliance on outsourcing to consultants, and in most cases the consultants they appoint are inexperienced in informal settlement upgrading, such as that layout that was produced. The city completely rejected by not just the community but ourselves as technical advisors. It simply ignored the existing structure of the community. Completely rejected. The lack of detail in the UISP instrument to guide city officials around firstly community participation. There's no clear guidelines on how you engage with the communities. There's no clear guidelines on what they mean by co-production in terms of getting communities to actually assist in the planning process. There's no guidelines on the various tenure options that could be made available. There's no guidelines, and one of the biggest blocking elements is land acquisition processes, because there's always going to be some level of, in a sense, decanting of people in order to put in infrastructure, that some people are going to have to be relocated and they need to be relocated onto alternative land, and that land is simply not being made available. Levels of acceptable services are not agreed to in policy and appropriate to building standards for structures. And even if they self-built structures, there's no guidelines around what are appropriate standards for safety purposes. And of course, there's a lack of alignment between internal and external government offices within the city council, between the city and the province. There's a lack of purposes. So finally, the most crucially, the funding arrangements in the UISP instrument effectively precludes proper partnerships and co-production, as the state always holds the purse strings and makes exclusive funding decisions. So whether it be appointing consultants or whatever, the community are never party to any of that. There's a real lack of transparency in these processes. So whether it be appointing consultants or whatever, the community. So what are the lessons from Slovo Park in terms of this instrument? Firstly, the instrument needs to properly facilitate incrementalism. The moment it views it almost like a greenfield project that begins on day one, and you get a budget, and you work as a project to the end over a 2 or 3 year period is what they wish for. And it simply doesn't work like that. So they need to have proper incrementalism that reflects community involvement and the priorities of the community. The instrument needs to clarify participation and co-production mechanisms. The instrument needs to facilitate flexibility in ordering of interventions such as tenure security issues, layout design. Infrastructure provisions will vary. To acknowledge that infrastructure provision will vary. The instrument needs to be determined by each settlement according to its unique characteristics and incremental approach. Here's just these graphics on the side here is of a